Hi, this is Sherry reminding you that while there are some who continue to diminish the rule of law and those whose job it is to enforce it, we will continue to hear directly from these enforcers on issues that should concern all of us. Remember, the only people who want to dismantle these agencies are the criminals. So join us because law matters. Our guest today is Ken Good, a noted bail attorney and board member of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I know we're going to have a lively discussion. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on.
Yeah, let's start with a little bit about you and your background so people know who they're listening to. How long have you been an attorney? When did you get involved with bail bondsmen? Tell us everything.
I'm 63 years old. I'm also married to another attorney, and we have 2 children. That's probably the thing I'm most proud of is that my 2 daughters. But when I graduated from law school, I was very active in law school on law review and then on speaking competitions. So I was always trying to do things that people said that were hard. And so that continued on when I was practicing law. I started out doing medical malpractice when representing doctors in hospitals when they were sued. And so as a young attorney, I would review all the cases that were issued or handed down by the Supreme Court of Texas looking for medical malpractice issues and things that were getting the attention of the courts of appeals. And so then we would go to trial if something came up and it was one of the issues that I had noticed that the appellate courts were taking interest in. I would make sure and preserve that issue for appeal. And so that if we had a decision that we didn't like, we could go up on appeal. And so I went to a medical malpractice seminar and they had a section on new and important cases. And 3 of the 5 or half of the 6 cases were my cases. And then there was a bondsman that got 45 default judgments and he needed help on getting those set aside. And he asked somebody, who do I hire to do stuff like this? And they said, you need an appellate attorney. So he hired me. And that's kind of what started me going down the road of getting interested in bail. I really clicked with the people involved in the bail industry. They're blue collar people. They work hard. They're not afraid of hard work. And they have conservative values for the most part. And so I started word of mouth spread. I started representing more people. I became Texas counsel for several insurance companies, several surety companies. And then I was elected to the board of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. I'm on their legislative committee. And then we started having these federal lawsuits being filed. And I went to a hearing in one of them and I just came out scared to death that the court was going to rule incorrectly. And so I took the position that we needed to become experts on this area of the law. And so that's what I set out to do. And all of my fears, I think, turned out to be validated because that judge was ultimately reversed 7 or 8 times. And the Fifth Circuit ultimately ruled that case should have never been filed in federal court. And so since then, I've written numerous articles on bail reform across the country. I've been published in the Attorney at Law magazine multiple times in other periodicals. I've been on debates with, some of the advocates pushing reform. And you've never really lived until you've been on a debate with someone who really can't respond to your arguments. So they just get down to saying you're racist and that jails are cages. So I feel like I've been trained through fire in some of these issues. But the most of them are just appellate issues or issues that just fall into an area of the law that I've always loved and always liked to delve into difficult issues and make myself either an expert or knowledgeable about them.
So what has changed on bail? It seems like bail reform, it seems like criminals aren't being held when they should be. And I think a good example of that were the migrants in New York who assaulted law enforcement. They weren't held on bail and they left the state. They just, okay, this is okay, we're gone.
Yes, I think we're having substantial issues. And I really kind of call it the difference between bad bail reform and good bail reform. And just to say it simply, good bail reform is reform that strengthens accountability and strengthens the courts so that they can punish people when they don't do what they say they'll do, like show up for court, which is what our system is built on. If you don't show up for court, then the cases can't go forward normally. And so, we're setting up bad bail reforms that, we don't require people to go to court and we can't hold them accountable if they don't. And shock of all shocks, that's shutting down our criminal justice system and nobody, seems to care in certain parts of our country. But I will say the biggest thing that's going on, and I think we've really uncovered it now that the election is over, is that before the election, a lot of this was being, you could say suppressed, not reported, but we weren't getting a true picture of what was going on. I did a podcast probably months before the election, and I was doing an interview with an author of an article, and the article was California legalized cartels and California legalized marijuana, and the cartels took over the industry. We did a podcast about it. We posted a copy of his article. It was immediately deleted off of social media. And I thought, well, this is just a mistake. And so I published it again, or I shared it again. It immediately got deleted again. And so suddenly I was like, questioning myself, are we being duped? Is this a hoax? Is this not reality? And then the next thing you know, you hear Trump talking about cartels and drugs in the election. And then since the election, some of the social media companies have announced that they're not going to be
fact checking.
Yeah, let's call it nice fact checking. And suddenly you share this article that they would have been immediately deleted 4 or 5 months ago. And suddenly now it's there. And I released my podcast with that guy, even though we did it months before the election. I think I released it today or yesterday. It's just incredible. And so this is where I'm coming down. Usually when you have crime starting to increase and you have all these things that are contrary to science, you will get a backlash. We should have had a backlash on these issues 2 years ago. We did not, in part because of this suppression or manipulation of the news, this fact-checking of the news. We're hearing forever that crime's not up. Just look at the FBI statistics. And then a month before the election, suddenly the FBI statistics were changed and they showed that crime was up. So I think that the backlash that one side of the political spectrum is going to suffer is going to be worse than it would have been, because we have had an artificial extension of their policies through manipulation of the news, suppression of the news, or whatever you want to call it. So the backlash, I think, is going to be bigger this time and last longer than it even did with Reagan, because people are going to see they're going to be safer pretty quickly as we remove gangs and career criminals from the streets just with our immigration policy.
Why do you think people, and I'm not the only one who's observed this, why do you think so many people feel that the authorities are more concerned about the rights, prosecutors particularly, are more concerned about the rights of the criminal, and the victim's rights don't seem to be addressed at all?
Well, okay, so first of all, I think the best answer is that it's a coalition. That it was a coalition, so it was groups of different people that made up the majority that then pushed those policies. Some in that coalition were hardliners that they don't feel like we should have prisons. They don't feel like we should prosecute crime. And then we have some, the well-intentioned people who feel like we should give people another chance. But then when policies start damaging society where we don't have public safety, those people shall pull away pretty quickly. And I think that's what you've seen. You've seen the public that questions public safety pulling away from that coalition. And so we're really repeating the cycle that we went through in the 60s, where we were feeling safe, we were more forgiving on our criminal laws, then we started seeing crime go up, and then we had a portion of one spectrum, one end of the spectrum refused to participate in fixing the problem, and so we end up having a backlash. And I think that's what's happening again. And the reason why we haven't seen it earlier is probably two reasons. Number one, the abortion issue as a result of the Supreme Court's ruling. I think in the last election, the abortion issue overruled or overtook or made up the difference on the people that were changing the way they were voting because of crime. And also, I think these suppression issues or fact-checking issues, if you want to call them that, where they were saying crime's not really up, it's just a perception issue. And I think the biggest problem is, I think that the party pushing that swallowed what their advocates were saying. And what their advocates were saying was not true. It was just argument, because that's what they wanted. So they're saying, people don't need bail. Everybody wants to come to court. They all want to resolve their criminal cases. Well, we discovered very quickly during COVID and thereafter that that's not true. And if you don't have consequences, people won't come to court. But the problem is they didn't change their policies as a result. And so they just doubled down, and you're going to see that. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next election in 2 years. What kind of candidates are they putting up? Because if I was facing a candidate that's going to say they're a moderate and they're pro-crime, I would say, well, that's the way Biden portrayed himself when he ran. So are you really going to rule as a moderate? Or are you going to be doing what other candidates from that party did in the past and say one thing, but when they get elected, do all kinds of damage to public safety?
I know I have asked locally, if you have cases that law enforcement are bringing to the prosecutor and the prosecutor refuses to prosecute these cases, do those numbers of the cases not prosecuted get added to the cases so that people know exactly how many bad guys have done bad things, what the numbers really are? Or are those numbers ignored? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, ma'am, I do. And I would say probably not, but it's going to depend from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But let me give you a really good example of what you're talking about. In Houston, Texas, which that's Harris County, like third largest county in the country, but they had a press conference announcing that crime was down. And then probably 6 months later, they had a press conference to announce that they had just discovered that over 260,000 criminal cases had been administratively closed with the notation, we don't have enough staff to investigate this. And
Right.
So you can see, well, of course, crime's going to appear to be down when you close administratively 260,000 cases. And I think that part of the problem we have right now is that politics has just infiltrated the criminal justice issue in numbers that we've never seen before. I mean, you've got these political groups, these advocates that are setting up 4 different types of advocacy groups. One is to identify candidates to elect district attorneys. So they're looking for people that are going to be soft on crime. And then once they're elected and they give them a bunch of money, they win because they're running in Democrat strongholds. Then once they win, they send them to seminars where they really make it clear it's a quid pro quo. These are the things that you're going to do, the worst of which is you're no longer going to seek enhancements. So when someone gets arrested with 20 pounds of fentanyl, they just get charged with possession of drugs instead of the enhancement. And so they only get 2 weeks in jail instead of 20 years. And then they have research groups that do cooking the books to say, oh, when we need to make these changes, it won't affect public safety. And then they have these groups that give them proposed tweets and proposed press releases that say, when we do this, it won't affect public safety. And that's what we've been operating on. And so this election was the first time that those groups lost as many DA races as they won. And we need to see much more of that to help public safety further.
I know in the county I live in, they are shorthanded in the prosecutor's office. It seems like the philosophy of the head prosecutor is not the same philosophy as other people. So a lot of people left, which
Yes.
means they don't have the staff to, actually prosecute some of these crimes. We had some young, I think, minor individuals who caused the death of another individual, another teen, and they were let out on probation. The very next day, they were on social media waving guns around, threatening the family. And
Yeah.
where's the justice in this?
Well, but that's one of the things these groups are advocating for when they give money to candidates for DA and then they're elected and they go to these seminars, is that they will not file charges against a minor as an adult. Like here in Texas, if you're 17 and you commit an adult crime, you can be charged as an adult. Well, one of the things these groups push DA candidates that they support once they get elected is they will not do that anymore. So what's the consequence of that? Then we have gangs and career criminals recruit minors just for these types of crimes because they get off or they're treated differently. And again, they see this as a cost of doing business. If, we can get a minor to come in and do this for us, there's really no consequences. So there's no accountability.
Yeah, there's no consequences. What I think is really sad are these minors. They wave a few dollars in front of them and they think, wow, I'm going to make some money. They don't realize or consider the ripple effect of the crime. what it does to their family, what it does to their friends. And this is just happening, and parents are pretty much unaware of it because these people are being recruited on social media, on these gaming sites and other sites. We need to educate people.
Well, but they're also recruiting from our urban areas where we have substantial numbers of, broken families or, failing families as a result of the government's, inaction. We also have people who are not educated. We know that if someone drops out of school, they have a higher chance of going to prison. So in our urban areas, it seems like the school's response to that is to dumb down the whole class to try to keep people from dropping out of school. And the long-term consequence of that is going to be more people are going to be in prison, even though they didn't drop out of school because they were not ever educated. They were just passed to the next level. And then our drugs are an incredible problem in our urban areas. And then with all these protests, if you want to call them that, or you want to call them riots, since 2020 that have burned down a lot of our urban areas, they have not been rebuilt. So they've lost economic opportunity as well. All those things make this worse. And so when we say we need to educate families, there's the people they're picking on don't have families. They don't have education. They're drug addicts or they have drug issues. And, they're just picking, they're picking easily. We're giving them easy pickings in these situations. And we don't seem to have a strategy. We haven't had a strategy for 20 years on dealing with a lot of these issues. And that's one of the reasons why I've been so critical of these bail reform policies, because it's like we're saying in our urban areas, we failed families, we failed schools, we failed economic opportunity, and we failed the drug issue. But have faith. We're going to cure it all on bail reform. No, it's been an absolute failure.
So what's the solution?
Well, we know how to fight crime. We teach it every day in our criminology classes in college, and we know what works and we know what doesn't work. And so we have to go back to that. And these crazy policies, which are not really policies, they've never been tested. They're not based on any science. They're one think tank publishing pseudo studies based upon other think tanks. And so it's really just advocacy. Probably the best example I can give you is there's this case called Sullivan versus Alabama, where this little county was required to live under a temporary injunction for 4 years where they couldn't hold anybody. They had to release them both for felonies and misdemeanors. And this little old county said, no, we're not going to give in. We're going to appeal because this isn't right. And it took 4 years to get the case reversed. And when it was ultimately reversed, they re-implemented a system of accountability. And if you didn't show up for court, then you suffered the consequences for it. And about 6 months later, what do you know? Crime started going down. You're already seeing it in these jurisdictions where they're picking up criminals that nobody was holding them accountable. And suddenly they're going to change their actions. The longer we keep at it, the safer we'll be. First with immigration and then with our criminals.
Let me ask you a question about the young man, Luigi, who murdered the CEO.
Yes, ma'am.
Cold-blooded murder in the back. The guy is a hero, clearly. It was on tape. Everybody watched it. And he is saying he's not guilty. That case is going to be strung out for how many years before justice is served? How can we make the prosecution of these cases faster? It shouldn't take 20 years, 30 years to prosecute somebody and come to a conclusion.
One of the biggest problems we have right now is that the courts were shut down for a period of time during COVID. And so even before COVID, we had huge backlogs in cases, which means we don't have enough courts. And then we did not have court for a year or more. But crime was still being committed. And even though we were arresting fewer people, we were still arresting people, the bad people. And so our bad cases are even backlogged even more. And so we have a whole bunch of cases waiting for trial. And, the problem is we got to find the sweet spot on getting this backlog taken care of. And, really the hard part is nothing, lowers the backlog more than just hard work. And I think that's difficult for the public to understand. And sometimes it's difficult for the judges who don't have, the best, they don't have a big handle on their cases to begin with. And so maybe we need some temporary courts. We need the ability for everybody to work together. But yeah, the problem is these bail policies that have no accountability are making it worse, because if I don't show up for court, there are very few situations. where they can go ahead and go forward with my case. I think they have to have started trial before I fail to appear, before they can go ahead and go forward with the case. So, when we have no accountability, they actually take advantage of the system because my case gets put on hold and the court waits for me to come back, whether it's an hour, a day, a week, month, a year, or never. In California, the misdemeanor cases have a really a quick turnaround because they have this statute that requires a Speedy Trial Act. And if they fail to appear, you can't make them come back. And if the Speedy Trial Act expires, then there's a huge pressure to dismiss the case. And so we got a lot of gaming the system going on, and it's going to continue until we re-implement accountability.
So if people are playing with the justice system, and I've seen it from, the White House all the way down to local level, they manipulate what's going on to procrastinate and push off, and, ultimately things get dismissed and I think there's a problem with that. How would you suggest we fix it? I mean, if you're
I think
convicted of a crime or you're, especially if it's on camera, we're watching you do this and now you're saying you didn't do it?
Well, we're in this period of time where we have these advocacy groups that are really, we're in this period of time where you really only prosecute your political opponents. That's what we're coming out of. Look at it where, in New York, murderers or people that committed really substantial crimes were being, given very light sentences, or they wouldn't prosecute them for the crime that they should have been prosecuted for, or they wouldn't seek a jail sentence, but then we're prosecuting someone on a technical violation of reporting statute and arguing that it's a felony because he's running for president. And the same thing, you can go into multiple election cycles where there have been examples of people from the other party doing things inside the Capitol and they don't even get prosecuted. And then you see the way the people that were treated for January 6th, and even though, you've got a candidate for president that wasn't charged with insurrection, all the arguments is he's committed insurrection, he shouldn't be allowed to run for real election. And all that came because he decided to run for re-election. So we're in this period of time where we're prosecuting our enemies. And so I know politics is always in, our criminal justice system, but it's permeated. It's to the point where it's almost third world level. And the public has lost faith in the criminal justice system. I remember a time where our politicians would not comment on a pending case and then as soon as it was over, they would come out and say, well, I may not agree with it, but we have to have faith in our criminal justice system. We're not the jury. We don't have that anymore. We've got people commenting on cases before they're in the jury. You've got people commenting, almost threatening the jury if they don't convict people while the case is going on. We've had cases where we've had barbed wire fences around the courthouse to protect the jurors, and you think they don't see stuff like that when they're trying to decide?
Exactly.
Yeah. You see that, and so it's kind of hard to argue that the person who was on trial was getting a fair trial. I don't. If you're married and have kids, how do you ignore all that stuff? And so, my problem is we have to build faith in the criminal justice system. And I don't know if we can do that right now because, we've got this purging going on as of last night, it looks like, in the DOJ, where anybody that was working on prosecuting certain people were fired overnight. And, they were saying, well, this is breaking the law because you can't fire somebody within 30 days or so many days of a new administration. But they found a loophole because these are the acting attorney generals doing it, not the new ones, because they're still in confirmation hearings. And they're doing it all in the name of returning to taking the politics out. But, once you get politics in, it just becomes this tit for tat. I've always thought that when the Democrats come up with an idea, they have to be careful because then when the Republicans take over, they'll take it to the next level. And so my hope is that this is one of those areas where that will not happen, because I feel like both parties historically have been law and order, and I'm hoping that this will return us to a law and order atmosphere. But the problem we have is we have so many people have lost their moral governors. We don't have that anymore. And then we have these advocacy groups that are just throwing money like crazy to argue that people should take certain positions. And so we're going to have to find a way to navigate that, whether we have the same type of advocacy groups on both sides, which I do not think we should have, or we have to figure out a way to get the ones that are in existence right now out of criminal justice, because they're doing great damage to the country. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why they're doing it. But I really think the number one reason is they started was the number one budget item in a county was criminal justice. And so they were looking for ways to reduce that budget and then move that money over to social programs. And they did that for a while, but I don't think that's working anymore. But they're not admitting that they were wrong. They're doubling down. And that's why they're losing more and more elections. And so we'll see if they start muting or changing their policies.
They're going to have to, because crime is just out of control. I mean, to
well,
the
but
point
for the last 2 years,
for
the last 2 years, for the last 4 years, they've been saying, no, crime's not increasing. It's just a perception versus reality issue. And they've relied upon the FBI statistics. Now that the FBI statistics have changed, that blows that argument out of the water. I mean, I wrote an article that was published in the Attorney at Law magazine questioning, pointing out, here's all the reasons why you should question whether the FBI statistics were accurate. And then 10 days later, it was discovered that they had quietly changed their statistics, and then suddenly crime was showing that it had increased, and they were still incomplete. I think that, but they've been relying totally on the FBI statistics to say that crime has not been increasing. And once that changed, I mean, you can see what they did. The very next week, they published an article from one of these groups that said, well, bail reform and criminal justice reform is not the reason why crime is increasing. So they immediately went to their fallback position because they knew how damaging that was to them.
Yeah, you've got criminals that aren't being held accountable.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about the youth. I know of some cases here in Arizona where down to 11 years old, committing adult crimes and not being held accountable. I mean, you've got to, if they're committing the crime, something has to happen. You don't just send them home to mommy.
11-year-old committing that crime just is a symbol of so many things broken down by society. I mean, that 11-year-old was not in a good place. I mean, to begin with. I mean, were they even in CPS, Child Protective Services? Were they in a foster home? Or were they in a broken home?
They were living at home and were recruited on a gaming site to go.
11-year-old in my house
money.
would not be able to be out of my house without me.
Yeah.
So,
true.
It's really, really sad. And there's so many things that we just don't know. But I would say that we're hitting the ground running with the new administration. They're starting with the immigration policy. They're removing criminals, and they're removing them quickly. I mean, you could see that they had issues over the weekend with Colombia, where they initially said they weren't going to take back their people, and then within hours changed their mind and said, okay, we're going to send our presidential plane to get them. You've got countries that are complaining about taking them back, but they're taking them back. And we're closing down the border. Well, then that we still have a whole bunch of other things to address. This issue of cartels and taking over the legal drug trade in the United States, where they're not just washing their money through the United States, they're bringing their whole industry in the United States. We're going to have to address that, and that's a reason that explains why crime is increasing across the country.
There's a couple of groups that will, and it was on the news, so I'm not making this up. There was a hole in the fence or the wall, and they set up their concession stand, and they were giving people water as they came through illegally because there's a hole in the wall. This isn't, the port of entry. Why are they not being held accountable for their actions of enabling these people to come through illegally and sending them on their merry way? Instead of saying, here's your water, go back over the border and come through the front door.
Well, I think that's a difference between the two administrations. We had our former administration, no matter what they want to say, they were not enforcing our border policy. In fact, if you think about it, when Trump brought up the Venezuelan gangs in the first debate, people, either his debate or the one with Harris, he was attacked for just being lying and that it wasn't true. I think over the weekend we just arrested 50 members of the Venezuelan gangs that were taking over apartments or doing all kinds of illegal trade in the United States. We've had a former administration that refused to enforce the immigration policies. And so once the federal government refuses to do that, I mean, Texas was trying to do things, but really all it could do is prosecute somebody for trespassing on somebody's land. And they had to get the landowners to agree to prosecute to be able to do that. And can you imagine if, let's don't say whether it's true or not, but if you've got gangs that are facilitating a lot of this illegal aliens coming into the United States, can you imagine what they would do to a landowner who's agreed to prosecute for trespass?
Yeah, they kill him.
Yeah, I mean, it would be very, very dangerous. And so we should admire landowners who were willing to step up to the plate to help fight these issues when they came up, and it was really once the Biden administration at the end was saying how successful they were, but they weren't successful. They were claiming the credit for everything that Texas had done at its border.
Okay, the attitude towards law enforcement. It seems not just locally, but nationally, people don't have the respect for the law in law enforcement like they used to when I was growing up. So what do you is it the same in Texas, and what do you think is going to change this?
I don't think it's the same in Texas because Texas is a very law and order state to begin with. And when it did bail reform several years ago, it strengthened bail reform. It did what I would call good bail reform, strengthened accountability and set up more consequences if you don't show up for court. But we have been through this period of time where we've undermined the police. Again, I think part of the reason why was because the largest budget item in a county was law enforcement. And so if they could undermine it, they could move those money. They wouldn't save it. They would move it to social programs. And now that they've come back, they're still paying that extra money to social programs, but they've refunded the police. So I think that was part of the motivation for that. But we also have to go back 3 or 4 election cycles, and about 6 months before every national election, there would be some incident, and then there would be some national outcry from, one side of the spectrum of politics saying that, our minorities are being mistreated, they should be angry, and they should come out and vote in larger numbers. And initially it was just a political thing, in my opinion, because after the election, they just went right back to what they were doing. But their voters noticed that. And so then they started electing these, what I would call true believers who just think, you can't trust the police ever. And so they started enacting these policies. And so a lot of this soft on crime is a natural outshoot from that as well, where they've been hearing that for a decade. And so they believed it, and they didn't think it was just politics. And so it's turning out that it was just politics to get people elected. And I would say you're seeing the same mistakes that were made in the 60s, because the people who started the call for change during that soft on crime policy was our minority communities, the pastors, because they were seeing the disproportionate impact on their churches and on their communities, and especially towards the men. And so they're the ones that originally, I don't think we remember that the war on drugs during Reagan was originally the call of the minority preachers. We're seeing that now. When the NAACP issues a call for a state of emergency on crime in Oakland, we're repeating that same thing. That's one of the reasons why we had this backlash during this election.
Do you think that people who come here illegally, crawl through the wall or are smuggled in, have rights?
Oh, that's a good question. Do people who come to the country illegally, do they have rights? I think they have human rights, but do they have rights as citizens of the United States? And that's really where I think that we've been blurring the line. I think one extreme of the political spectrum would argue that they do. And, there would be arguments. That's the whole reason why we had a lax immigration policy. There was an argument they were trying to bring in a whole level of new voters. And I kind of agree with that. I think that there was this concern that they would start losing elections, and so they needed to bring in new voters that would support them. But I think in this last election, one of the things that you found was that the minority community, especially the Hispanic community, was more conservative on immigration policy than that
Everybody
extreme
else
of the political spectrum ever expected. And so once they realize that there's a backlash on that, if they conclude that's what it was, then I think that you're going to see that both parties are going to kind of come back to the middle, because if they don't think it's going to help them politically in the long term, then they realize, well, then there's no benefit. And if they think it's going to hurt them, then they'll shift immediately or much more quickly. The problem I see going forward is, we've got, in the last presidential election, when we truly had a primary, Biden was the only thing that prevented the Democrats from putting up a far left candidate. And he said he was a moderate, but he didn't rule or govern as a moderate. The next primary, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats to put up someone other than a far left candidate, because that's what they're set up for. The only thing that prevented that with Biden was the Obama coalition with Wall Street. I think that coalition's dead now. And so the Democrat Party is going to have to make a new coalition. And I think they're going to have to lose one more election nationally. And so I think the next election you'll have a far right candidate, because, they usually come back and say, well, the reason why we lost is because they weren't liberal enough. And then I think once that happens, you'll see the Democrat Party start to come back to where it historically has been, as a law and order policy on crime issues.
It would be nice to see people working together instead of fighting each other all the time. I miss the John McCains and the Colbys and, people who actually had a brain.
Well, but, we've gotten rid of our extremes. I mean, we've gotten rid of the middle of our parties. One of the consequences of getting rid of the filibuster is that we no longer force compromise. I mean, I just hate it. But ever since Obama, the first thing we do for the first week is try to undo everything that the last president did. And we've never done that before, I think, Obama. But now we do that every time the presidency changes parties. The first few days, the first week, first couple of weeks is we're undoing everything we can by executive order that the past president did.
Yeah, good, better, and different. And that's just so wrong.
Well, it's just so destructive. I remember a time when we argued that there was no difference between a Democrat and a Republican because they were all pretty much the same on law and order issues. And then we've gotten away from that. And right now, the parties couldn't be more different on almost all issues. I mean, it really started when the Democrats didn't even agree that we had a budget issue. I mean, the deficit wasn't a problem. And so they refused to acknowledge or cut spending. And one of the reasons why spending has been so out of whack is because the Republicans finally got to the point, say, if you won't acknowledge it's a problem, then we're not going to argue that it's a problem because we're just getting hurt by it. And so that's one of the reasons why we've had this terrible spending for a while. And so hopefully that's going to turn around as well.
Well, they don't want to acknowledge that Trump added over $3 trillion to the deficit. So I want to ask you something about birthrights. Because that's something that's, you're an attorney. I know you're into bail bondsmen, but I want your opinion. When I lived in California, the house across the street was a place where pregnant women could go there. They were from all these different countries, Guatemala, Iran, Mexico. Ambulance would show up 2-3 times a week, take the pregnant woman to the hospital so she can have her baby, and then you'd never see her again because she was sent back to whatever country she came from. When I think birthrights, I don't think people coming over here to have a baby and then just leaving. I think of people who are here working and living and here legally, if they have kids, okay. What is your opinion on birthrights? If they're here legally or illegally, or if they're here on a visa and have a baby, that kid is automatically an American citizen? I don't get it.
Well, I think, I'm going to look at the amendment really quick. Okay, so this was an amendment that was enacted right after the Civil War, where we had a whole bunch of people in our country who you would argue
were brought over.
Yes, it was intended to be a resolution for the slaves that were here. And the two-prong test was that you're here and you're not under anyone else's jurisdiction. And somehow over time, that morphed into, if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States, and it completely forgot the second prong that says you're not under anyone else's jurisdiction. So if you're in Korea and you fly over just so you can have your baby in the United States, there is an argument to be made that you're not entitled to birthright citizenship because you're under someone else's jurisdiction. You're under the jurisdiction of South Korea. So the problem is that's not the way we've been interpreting it. That's not the way I think either party's interpreted it for a while. But now Trump has said this is the way we're going to interpret it. And of course, one court has already done an injunction. But that's what Trump wants. He wants it to go up to the Court of Appeals and then to the Supreme Court of Texas. It'll probably get there really quick, probably have an oral argument, probably within the second year of Trump's presidency. But, and it'll be interesting to see at the Supreme Court how they rule, because right now the majority of the Supreme Court by 6-3 are traditionalists, and traditionalists look at the Constitution's meaning at the time it was written. At the time that issue was written, it was intended clearly to apply to slaves or similarly situated people at that time who were under nobody else's jurisdiction. That's not so. It'll be interesting. The problem I see is you've got Roberts and you've got Barrett, who are kind of the compromise Republicans, and I think it'll be very difficult for them to change like 150 years of the way it's being interpreted, to go back to say, no, that's not the real interpretation. But you would expect a traditional someone at the Supreme Court who's a traditional person who interprets the Constitution the way the drafters intended, they would say that Trump's correct on birthright citizenship. It should be an interesting argument. If I was going to say today, guess, I would say I would expect it to be 5-4 with the two compromise people siding with the liberals for Trump to lose. But it's an important issue. So it could be 6-3. It could be 5-4 in his favor. But if I was going to guess today, I would say probably 5-4 against him.
Personally, I hope they change it, because the interpretation at the time, so the listeners understand, when slaves are brought over here, they're living here. If they had babies, their babies weren't given the right to citizenship. And that's why it was changed.
Or even from the country they came from.
Or exactly.
So they were a ship without a port.
Exactly. So, to have people, and I know the person who owned the house across the street from me in California had a business. He'd bring, hey, you want to have your kid in America? Pay X amount of dollars, have your kid, and then go back home. And I'm like, that's wrong.
Well, Trump argues we're the only country in the world that does this. I don't know whether that's true. I mean, I discount things that we hear from any politician, Trump or anybody. But more often than not, when he says stuff, it turns out to be true. We declare initially that it's a lie, and then later it turns out to be true. But I don't care whether any other country does it. My question is, should we be doing it?
And should we be interpreting it the way?
Yeah, should we? I mean, yes. Should we be interpreting our Constitution to mean that? And were we? I don't think that's the correct interpretation. But we've been doing it for so long. I don't know if it'll be difficult and a tough road to change it at this point.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I agree with him on. So, tell me something. I know when people think bail bondsman, they think Dog the Bounty Hunter.
Well, Dog Bounty Hunter's not a bondsman. So,
but he works with them.
But he's a recovery agent. So he works on high-profile cases when they have failed to appear for court, and the bondsman can't locate them. And so he's entered into a contract with the bondsman to go find them. And so that's why Dog the Bounty Hunter. He's a bounty hunter finding people who failed to appear for court. A bondsman, I mean, you really should think of a bondsman as almost a quasi member of the criminal justice system. I mean, they're a private industry, but their job is to get people to court. And so we require people to check in with us. We probably on the higher the bond amount, the more we involve family. And so, I think we don't realize that when, your sister stands up for you and says, I'm standing up for this person, and I'm saying they'll go to court. I mean, there are a lot of important ramifications of that to the defendant and to the criminal justice system. So to the defendants, they're being told they still have value. And so the family is the ones that are having the biggest impact on getting defendants to turn around and become productive citizens. They can turn their backs on their family so many times that they're career criminals, and then nobody will help them. And those are the people that need to stay in jail. But the bondsmen, once they get out, they have to check in and they have to report. And if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, the bondsmen have the ability to report them back to the court and say, we need to bring them back into custody. And so we're working hand in hand with the court to get them to show up and to get their criminal cases resolved.
So if the court says we need to get them back in court, is it up to the bondsman to go tell them you have to go to court?
Most of the time, yes. That's one of our big responsibilities. We coordinate. We tell them, hey, you've got a court hearing. Or when they check in, they say, hey, I've got a court hearing. So we have counties that require us in Texas to give them notice of their court hearing. So, we need to know when they're going to have a court so we can remind them, because that's what we're promising to do. We're promising that they will appear for court. And if they don't, we have to pay the face amount of the bond to the county. And, the difference is this is all done at no cost to the taxpayers. And, when people try to replace us, they can only replace us at great cost to get anywhere close to doing what we do. New Jersey tried it, and they ended up having to do a statewide tax increase to fund what they were trying to do. And they ended up still running out of money for it. And crime it's gone up.
Explain to the listeners how the bonds work. You've got a criminal goes to court, and the judge sets the bond.
So a criminal goes to court, and the judge, like in Texas, is required to review their criminal history. So have you been arrested before? What's the nature of the crime? They do consider your ability to pay. It's just not the only consideration. And there's a list of other factors that the court is required to consider in setting bail. If it's your first time offense and, you're not going to be held. We have all this criticism saying, people can't get out of jail on low-level bonds. And that's not true. I think charitable bail funds found that out really quickly, and that's the reason why they've been getting in trouble for posting cash bonds, because they've been posting them for very dangerous people. So a bond is set. In Texas, there's 3 types of bonds that can be posted. There's a cash bond where someone posts the full amount of the bond in cash. So if the judge sets the bond at $100,000, you can post cash in the amount of $100,000. You can go to a bondsman and you can pay 10%. So you'd pay $10,000, and then the bondsman posts a $100,000 bond, which is just a piece of paper saying, I'm posting the $100,000 bond. Or you can get a personal bond. The court approves a personal bond for you, which is your promise that if you don't show up, you'll pay $100,000, which is just a pinky promise. And I don't think I've ever seen one of those collected. And so you get out, the judge posts it, you decide which type of bond you're going to get, or you're going to post, and then you post it, you get released from jail. And if you're posting a cash bond, then you have to keep up with when you have to show up for court. When you get released on a surety bond, then you're going to report to your bondsman. They're going to remind you of when you need to show up for court, and they're going to continue staying in touch with you until your criminal case is resolved, or until you fail to appear, and then they're going to try to find you and bring you back to court. And then if you have a personal bond, again, it's your responsibility to keep track of when you go to court. And that's probably the biggest problem I see. Each different release mechanism has a different failure to appear rate. And, the criminal cases can't go forward if you fail to appear. So the bonding industry has a failure to appear rate of less than 10%. Cash bonds probably have twice that or maybe more. So let's say a 25% failure to appear rate. Personal bonds have a 50 to 80% failure to appear rate. And mainly because there's no accountability. So they fail to appear, they get another personal bond. They fail to appear, they get another personal bond. We've got examples from Houston where they get 17 personal bonds.
Oh my God.
And, which is just lining them up. Get one, don't come up. Get one, don't come. And there's no consequences for that. There's a place for personal bonds, especially for protecting the poor. But once you have a criminal history, the judge can say, you're not going to get a personal bond, and I'm setting your bond probably higher than you can afford, but it's because you have a criminal history. Because you have to give the court assurances, because that's what bail is. What assurance are you going to give the court that you're going to return, but also that you're not going to be a problem for public safety. And if you have a criminal history, then you're going to be more of a problem for public safety. And if you have a history of failing to appear, then your bond can be set higher, even if you can't afford it.
What about the immigrants that come across and they're given a court hearing, 10 years down the road? Don't forget to show up for court. What kind of garbage is that?
Well, immigration bonds or immigration issues are going to be the number one problem I see going forward with our criminal justice system. Because imagine someone is charged with murder, but they have here illegally. What do we do with them? Do we go ahead and try them and put them in prison, or do we deport them? And I think you're going to see that Trump is going to take the position that we need to deport them. Well, what does that do to the criminal case? I mean, what does that do to the victim? Are we going to require the criminal case to be dismissed? What about the bondsman who posts a $100,000 bond for an individual and then they get deported? Are we just going to use the deportation as a revenue maker for the county? So we're going to put all the bail bond business out of business by making them pay bonds for people who are deported? I don't think that's the intent. And so those are issues that we're going to have to address pretty soon as the immigration deportations grow.
And what's the guarantee this person isn't going to sneak back into the country like so many of them have?
True, but I think once we close our borders and we send out the message that you're no longer going to get in here, and I think that's true. But if we start with the premise that the criminal case cannot go forward if they're not here and we deport them, then are we going to just have these cases pending on the books, or are we going to dismiss them and see if they come back? I would argue that we should be, if we're going to deport somebody and the criminal case can't go forward, it should be dismissed, at least without prejudice, so that the case can be closed and then the bond forfeiture resolved, and we should not be taking advantage or trying to seek income from the bail industry for something that's outside of their control.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all.
No, but it's one of those issues that's going to be all over the country as deportations rise, because I've got an example of someone who bonded an individual out of jail on substantial criminal charges, but he had a green card. Now, historically, a green card means they're here legally and there's not subject to deportation. But the charges were so substantial. I mean, it was a $200,000 bond, so they were substantial criminal charges. And when he was released, they revoked his green card status and deported him, even though he had a wife and family. I mean, a wife and children. So he was deported, and the bondsman's calling me saying, what do I do about this bond forfeiture? And I'm like, under current law, there's no defense unless the county agrees to work with you, because your bond is what allowed the guy to be released from jail. I think we're going to find more and more that Trump's going to require release from jail because of their immigration status. So this is going to be a growing issue that we're going to have to tackle and make decisions as a society of how we want to cover this issue, because there's going to be some victims that want justice, and they are not going to think justice is deportation. They want tried and put in prison. Flesh. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So apparently the crime was pretty egregious for that type of a bond to be set. Will they send the family back to deport the family with him? If you have one bad apple in your family, everybody goes?
Well, in my example, they just deported him. But, I think Trump's new immigration person was asked that question. It's like, what are you going to do to keep families together? He said, well, the only thing we can do to keep the family together is send them all back.
That makes sense. So that's
if you want to stay together, if you want to stay together, you all have to go, because this one's not staying. We're not going to be subject to those types of arguments anymore.
And stop breaking the law. That's
well, simple. I don't know. I have sympathy for issues. I have sympathy on these issues. Everything doesn't fit the same narrative. But the problem is, the reason why we're here is because of a failure to do anything by the opposing party, the opposing party from the far spectrum of its ranks. And so what we're seeing now is an overcorrection because they refuse to do anything. And so this is the direct result of the actions of the far left.
It'll be really nice when this country gets back to the middle again.
Yeah, I agree.
Use some common sense on both sides.
Yeah, but it's going to take us a while because, right before the turnover from Biden to Trump, Soros, which is one of these advocacy groups, or he's the main guy funding these advocacy groups, he bought a bunch of radio stations, and they rushed through the approval process before Trump came into office. So, the main advocate for the far left bought a bunch of radio stations, and that the purpose of it was so that he can have a platform to argue in favor of what he thinks the politics or the policy should be. And we know from the past that they're going to cook the books on their reports, and they're going to split hairs to make it sound better than it is. And they have all this money. They have professional PR people that are going to help them to sell it. And we have to hold tough on, if it doesn't sound right, then it's not right. I think that's the lesson from this period of time. If it doesn't smell right, then it's sour.
Yeah. And what's the name of that radio group?
I don't remember the name of the groups, but I just remember the stories. And right before the election, they rushed it through to get it approved. Just Google
Scary.
Soros and radio stations. I think that'll pull it up. Let me see. Yeah, Soros radio station. Yeah, House Oversight probes FCC expedited approval. So the FCC approved Soros' purchase of 200 plus radio stations ahead of the election. 200 plus radio stations. And it's AUDACY, Odyssey radio stations across America.
Into that. For sure. Well, I want to thank you again. We're almost out of time here, and I want to thank you for coming on and going over some of these really tough topics. It's hard sometimes to wrap your mind around what's going on, because it seems to change every day, every 24 hours. You've got a new something going on.
Well, and I would say, and thank you for having me, but I would just say that the lessons we're learning just in the last 2 weeks is there was so much information that was being either fact-checked incorrectly or suppressed, if you really want to be correct about true. And that was impacting our policies in an improper way. And so now all those things are coming out, and, they're saying Trump is winning. Well, he's winning because the truth is coming out, and we would not have Trump if they hadn't overreached to begin with. I mean, think about this. Let's just close with this. If Trump had been reelected in 2020, he would have had one or both chambers of Congress controlled by the other party, and he would have gotten little to nothing done. Maybe even would have been impeached one more time. And as a result, he would have been somewhere probably in the middle to the lower spectrum of presidential candidates, presidents. But because of the actions that they took against him, he really educated himself on the system, how it works. He's also become hardened on what he's going to do. And he also came back into office with both chambers for at least the first 2 years under Republican control. And so he's a much more empowered president. He's going to have a much freer hand. And so he's going to get things done that he would have never been able to do in a second term.
True. Things happen for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for being here. Thank you for enlightening us. And before we leave, I want to ask our listeners to check out the lawmatters1030.org website. You'll find our web store there, all our podcasts. And please help support our C3 mission by joining our 1030 Challenge. I also want to thank your guests for chatting with us today, and I want to thank our listeners for tuning in because law matters.